The horses' hooves struck hard against the frozen ground, their rhythm echoing through the bare winter woods. Belle Starr pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, the February wind biting deep through the cloth. The sun was sinking behind the leafless trees of Indian Territory, stretching shadows across the lonely track that wound toward her small cabin near Younger's Bend. She was alone, her mare moving at an easy pace, the cold air filled with the faint creak of saddle leather and the distant call of crows. Belle had ridden these trails countless times, but this evening something felt different. The air seemed too still, the silence too sharp, as though danger lingered just out of sight. By then, Belle Starr was no stranger to danger. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley in Missouri in 1848, she had grown up in the turbulence of the Civil War. Her family sympathized with the Confederacy, and she spent her youth around men who would become infamous guerrillas. Jesse James and Cole Younger were names that hung in the air around her like smoke, figures she claimed to know personally. The war left scars across Missouri and Arkansas, and Belle carried those scars into adulthood. She became known for her skill with horses, her taste for pistols, and her willingness to live outside the law when it suited her. In the years that followed, her life became entwined with the outlaw world. She married Jim Reed, an outlaw who ran with desperado gangs, and together they slipped between towns in Texas and Indian Territory. Reed was shot and killed in 1874 during a failed escape, leaving Belle a widow with two young children, Pearl and Eddie. She kept moving, kept surviving, and her reputation only grew. She later married Sam Starr, a Cherokee outlaw, and together they built a reputation as leaders among the criminal bands that roamed Indian Territory. Horse theft, bootlegging, harboring fugitives, whatever it took to keep money in their hands and the law at bay. Belle became known as the Bandit Queen, the rare woman who held her own in the violent underworld of the frontier. By the 1880s, though, the frontier itself was closing. The railroad pushed westward, towns grew, and the law tightened its grip. Outlaws who once moved freely across open country now found themselves hemmed in. Belle's world grew smaller, more precarious. In 1886, Sam Starr was killed in a gunfight with a law officer, leaving Belle once again widowed. She continued to live on the edge of the law, sometimes accused of crimes, sometimes acquitted, always surrounded by suspicion. She lived at Younger's Bend, a rough patch of land along the Canadian River, where she farmed, kept horses, and still mingled with outlaws who came and went. By February 1889, Belle Starr was 40 years old. She had lived longer than many of the men she rode with, but enemies and tensions circled her. She quarreled with neighbors, clashed with her son Eddie, and was rumored to be involved with younger men who drifted in and out of her life. The myth of the outlaw queen still surrounded her, but in truth, her life was a hard, lonely existence. The wide-open West was vanishing, and Belle was a relic of a fading era. On the morning of February 3, 1889, she rode to town for supplies. Witnesses later recalled seeing her in the company of men she knew well. Some said she argued with her son Eddie, who had grown resentful and violent. Others claimed she had disputes with neighbors over stolen horses. Rumors swirled that she had crossed the wrong man, or perhaps even her own child. Whatever the truth, by late afternoon, Belle mounted her horse and began the ride home. The road wound through a lonely stretch of timberland, the kind of place where an ambush could be set without notice. The cold air carried no warning. As Belle approached a narrow stretch of trail near her cabin, gunfire shattered the silence. The first blast ripped through her back, slamming her forward in the saddle. A second shot rang out, striking her again. She fell from her horse, collapsing into the dirt, her shawl tangled in the reins. Struggling to rise, she reached for her pistol, but the attacker closed in. Witnesses later claimed the killer used a shotgun, firing at close range to make certain she would not live. Belle Starr died there on the road, just 40 years old, her body left sprawled in the dust of Indian Territory. Her murder shocked the region. The Bandit Queen, gunned down not in a grand shootout or a celebrated manhunt, but in an ambush along a lonely trail. The investigation began quickly, but answers never came easily. Suspicion fell on her son Eddie, who had quarreled with her bitterly in the days before. Others pointed to a neighbor named Edgar Watson, a man known for violence and suspected of horse theft. Watson was arrested briefly, but the case collapsed for lack of evidence. Some whispered that Belle had simply made too many enemies over too many years, and in the end, one of them caught her alone. No one was ever convicted. The identity of her killer remains unknown. The funeral was small, but the stories that followed were larger than life. Newspapers, always eager for dramatic tales from the frontier, seized on Belle's murder. They painted her as the notorious Queen of the Bandits, a woman who had ruled over outlaw men and lived by her own code. Some accounts exaggerated her connections to Jesse James and the younger brothers, while others portrayed her as a ruthless schemer. The truth was more complicated. She was a woman who had survived in a brutal world, raised children in the shadows of violence, and navigated a life where law and lawlessness blurred together. In death, she became legend. For her daughter Pearl, the aftermath was painful. Pearl later turned to prostitution in Fort Smith, her life shaped by the notoriety of her mother's name. Eddie, her son, drifted further into crime and eventually met his own violent end. The family carried the weight of Belle's legacy, one built as much on myth as reality. The story of her murder only fueled the legend, the mystery of who fired the fatal shots, leaving space for endless speculation. The killing of Belle Starr marked the end of an era. By 1889, the outlaw frontier was already fading, its figures hunted down, imprisoned, or dead. Within a few years, the frontier itself would be declared closed. The woman who had once ridden at the side of men like Sam Starr and claimed kinship with Jesse James became a symbol of a West that no longer existed. Her last ride on that winter road was a reminder that the age of outlaws was not ended by glory, but by betrayal, ambush, and silence. More than a century later, the legend of Belle Starr remains. Songs, dime novels, and films would later carry her story to audiences who knew little of the real woman behind the myth. Yet, the fact remains. On February 3, 1889, Belle Starr died on a dirt road in Indian Territory, gunned down by an unseen hand. Her story is the story of the frontier itself, harsh, violent, and unforgiving, where survival came at a cost and the end often came suddenly. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.